Welcome to Shelter in Solidarity, a deep dive with artists and activists and experts during this extended COVID pandemic. I'm your host, Joe Ramsey, Zoomcasting with you here from Dorchester, Massachusetts on the south side of Boston. Now in effectively year 2, 2021, this COVID pandemic continues and the crisis of capitalism with it. We are here in our second show in 2021, and we are picking up a very timely theme, namely the beginning of the Biden administration. Our topic, our question today is building back with Biden, ? New Deal or same old deal? We are joined with 3 terrific guests, 2 of which will kick off our discussion, and then a very, very appropriate respondent. We will have Doug Henwood, who I'm sure is no stranger to many of you. Doug Henwood, a commentator and writer for Jacobin magazine, longtime contributor to The Nation magazine. You may have seen him on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah in recent weeks, commenting on the GameStop kerfuffle, and also an author and founder of Behind the News and Left Business Observer. Doug, it's so great to have you back on Shelter in Solidarity.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Great. Joining Doug next in the lineup will be Bryan Snyder, an old friend of mine I'm so pleased to have just recently reconnected with, professor of economics at Bentley University, but as well as a contributor to Dollars and Cents magazine. Bryan, it is great to have you with us.
A pleasure.
Terrific. And joining us a little bit later in the conversation, though not too much later, as we hope to get to discussion soon, is another guest who needs no introduction, but I'll give a very brief one. Medea Benjamin, who is the co-founder of the activist and peace, feminist and peace organization Code Pink, among other organizations, and author of, it seems like close to a dozen books, and a stellar activist intellectual, particularly, but not only on issues of international justice and peace and anti-war movements, and we'll be bringing her in soon. Medea, it's so great to have you, and I'm glad I can say back on Shelter in Solidarity for the second time.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Terrific. We're going to dive right in here. Glad to have, we have a very robust audience tonight. And I want to just remind everyone, as always on Shelter in Solidarity, though we do present some great expert activist testimony and perspective, our goal is to ignite and to continue a community conversation. So we do hope that you will keep a list of your own questions and comments, in whether you want to put them in the chat box, message me as the moderator or one of our producers, and we will work you into the conversation as soon as possible. We're definitely around the half an hour, 45-minute mark. We're going to hope to go to discussion today. But in the meantime, please do keep yourself muted. As always here on Zoom, if you are heard, you will be seen, and who knows what we'll see. So please, let's give our guests a few minutes, and then you'll be joining us shortly and hitting them with whatever thoughtful questions you can come up with. All right, Doug and Bryan, we'll start with you. As promised, I wanted to give you a few minutes at the start of the show to unfurl your perspective on this moment we are in with respect to this Biden administration, the Biden regime. What are the openings, opportunities, or dangers that you see this new administration posing for the people, the planet, for the left in particular? I'll let you frame things any way that you like, but we'll start with Doug. I mean, how do things look to you, Doug? Whether based on Biden's history, on the early indications of this administration, the overall kind of objective situation, what do you think we should be looking for? What do you see as the kind of, I guess you could say, the upside and the downside of this new administration taking office this past month?
I just want to open with a brief, and I regret that I was not able to outfit myself as a cat, but I just didn't get the technology down in time. But I'd just say to start with, take a quick look at the economic landscape. And this is the weirdest economy one could ever imagine. It's very, very bifurcated between the upper classes and everyone else. So we've regained about a little over half the jobs that were lost between February and April. But progress has stalled in the last few months. We're still getting about 750,000 people a week filing for unemployment insurance, which is down significantly from last spring, but still extraordinarily high by historical standards. The unemployment rate is down, but still also high by historical standards and not fully capturing the people who are just dropped out of the labor market. But there's also a big class difference. So we've seen most of the people in the upper income categories either continuing to work or going back to work, whereas people in the lower brackets are not doing anywhere near as well. So we're actually seeing this weird phenomenon of wages rising in the midst of this crisis, but it's mainly because the people at the bottom are not showing up in the statistics. So it looks like wages are doing well, but in fact, for an awful lot of people, they're barely getting by. The Census Bureau says something like 30 million people are having trouble getting food on the table. It's still very, very high. In normal times, it's only 20 million. So, which is, pretty disgraceful, but that's life in America. So in this, and then of course, we've seen the financial markets go absolutely crazy. The stock market reaching new records, just every possible sign of a bubble you could imagine, completely detached from the economic reality that a lot of people are living. So it's been an economy that's been pretty good to people who are above median or in the top third of the population, and not so good for everyone else. Now, into this comes the Biden administration, which I have to say is, as they say on Wall Street, coming in above expectations, at least on the economic side. I suspect Medea will have more to say about the foreign policy side, which is, I imagine, going to be much more a typical, what used to be a Cold War Democrat, but whatever the modern version of that we want to call, is still bellicose, still very much, and actually trying to restore a lot of the damage that Trump did to the American empire. But on the economic side, it's not so bad. So we have, let me refer to my cheat sheet here because I can't remember all these names here. Brian Deese, who's the director of the National Economic Council, comes out of the Obama White House, but also worked at BlackRock as their head of sustainable investing. So he kind of represents the liberal wing of Wall Street, which is growing in importance these days. The BlackRock, run by Larry Fink, he's been talking about climate. But also Larry Fink finds the early Biden moves on climate a little too extreme. Larry wants to move a little slower. So that's what we're seeing. I think this kind of liberal wing of Wall Street has a large presence. The Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, very serious person. I have a lot of respect for her. And she's saying a lot of the right things. She said in her opening welcome letter to the staff of Treasury that she wanted to make systemic racism and climate change at the core of Treasury policy. This is not an income inequality. This is not the way normal Treasury secretaries speak. But she's also an extremely competent person coming after the idiocies of the Trump years. It's just nice to know somebody who's a pretty decent human being who knows what she's doing. It's really nice, nice change. The chair of the Council of Economic Advisors is a labor economist, Black woman, not your usual kind of Wall Street functionary. Two of the other members, the other two members of the Council of Economic Advisors, I personally know.
Me too.
Well, yes, we were IRPI comrades with Jared Bernstein.
Absolutely.
I served in a steering committee with Jared. I used to row around the lake at IRPI camp with Heather.
For those who don't know, I'm just sorry, just for those who don't know, IRPI is the Union for Radical Political Economy, actually where I met Brian years ago in the wake of the Occupy movement. So
yeah, that's where I met Brian too years ago. We used to hang out together. But these are not just, they're not liberal Wall Street, to the left of that. So these are very fine people. The director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Rohit Chopra, I have a friend who works there who says that he's pretty good. And a lot of the staff is very excited. The chair of the SEC, Larry Gensler, who has not yet been confirmed, but Wall Street is not very fond of this choice. He's a bit stricter a regulator than anyone expected. Now, of course, so liberal Wall Street is not going to come maybe better than conservative Wall Street, but it's not going to be, revolutionary. But there's some good people here, and the early executive orders are pretty good. So on these kinds of domestic policy issues and on climate, I got to say it's better than I expected. And the enthusiasm for a significantly large rescue package, or whatever we want to call it, almost $2 trillion, is remarkable. And it looks like they don't want to repeat the mistakes of the Obama administration, which was too little and giving up on it too early. So, it could be a lot worse. Maybe it's just the fact that, after 4 years of Trump, it's that sensation you get when you stop beating your head against a wall. It feels good for a little while, but then you realize you've been beating your head against the wall, and maybe it's not so good after all. Maybe expectations have been beaten down so much. But again, I think my summary phrase would be, it could be a lot worse.
Yeah, thanks for that, Doug. I mean, it is difficult to subtract the subjective dimension coming out of the Trump years, right? I mean, just the mental strain of dealing with the daily tweets and whatnot. But I appreciate that. That really covered a lot in just a few minutes there. I'd like to come back at some point, maybe to get your thoughts on what makes liberal Wall Street liberal, or where, but first, let's bring in Bryan. And Bryan, I mean, we spoke a bit on Tuesday in preparation for the show, and you indicated a number of directions you're ready to speak to. I mean, the openness of the first question to Doug is certainly available to you, but I thought one thing you spoke about on Tuesday when we were preparing was this issue of like how this administration compares or is likely to kind of compare ultimately to the Obama administration. I mean, of course, it's inevitable that Biden having been the vice president or Obama, a lot of comparisons for better or for worse going on there. I'm kind of curious what stands out to you in this initial period in terms of Biden's position, Biden and his cabinet positioning, and with respect to the Obama administration that came before. And also another question. Yeah, I mean, so why don't we start there? And then I also am interested in your thoughts on where the real power in this administration is. I mean, as you mentioned, there can be a difference between naming someone to a position and that person actually having the power to make and being authorized to make decisions. So could you lead us into a little bit of, maybe that's two questions for you. How do you see this administration in relationship to the Obama administration? And how do you see it, where do you see the power actually kind of accumulating in this administration in terms of its, the complex dynamics of it?
Okay, I really appreciate hearing Doug's guarded optimism about this, because I've been kind of poring over. I actually have like a cheat sheet put out by the American Prospect as far as who's who. It's sort of like a fantasy football rotisserie of cabinet officials and everyone. So you get to kind of handicap who's doing what. And the first thing I did was I went immediately back to who were Clintonites back in the day and who were Obama administration folks, and I kind of worked through it. There is a surprisingly large amount of people who are not part of the Obama administration. And most importantly, too, is that the ones who were part of the Obama administration, we can deal with. Janet Yellen, it's nice to have a competent person, and a person that can actually, when they're looking at money and finance, actually brings up questions of labor. Imagine that. Okay. So it's nice to have occasional adults. Now, we are in a different situation. 2008, remember, boom, the economy blows up. And so we have a situation where Wall Street's leading this. Where we are now is a significantly different place. Okay, we had a bubble that blew up, and then Occupy Wall Street as a reaction to it. We had 4 years of a regime that at best were vandals, at worst were, I just like to see things burn, okay? And the states were set up in such a, is set up in such a way that it's not to actually do the function of the state, it's essentially to set it up to fail. You have benign neglect and active neglect in various departments per se. I mean, it really is a bit of a horror show. Now, the economy was already getting particularly funky. Remember that someone decided that they could.
So far. Don't worry, I'll bring cookies or something.
That they could win a trade war. Oops. And then already things were fairly weak. We had all sorts of problems with income distribution, et cetera. But this is a fairly weak economy. And then we get poleaxed with the plague. The plague hits. I can remember back in March, I was talking with the Economics Club of Hong Kong, some of my former students, and dealing with the effects, the global effects of this particular pandemic. And the global effects was basically, remember, we have this globalized neoliberal regime, Washington consensus, whatever you want to call it. but it was predicated on the free flow of labor and capital and commodities globally. The sucker seized up. And that because of the integration, supply chain et al., that unsticking this, even when we can get a hold of get on top of this pandemic eventually, is not an easy proposition. Plus, also, you have a major realignment from a fully globalized economy to a more balkanized economy dealing with spheres of influence. It's, as they say, it's a new game when it comes to the global economy. So the economy is already getting weird. Now, remember, going into this election too, is that the politics are going to be different. Now, I think that you could use the word, hope. Remember that thing from Obama? It's hope. It's a sort of naivete of, yay, hey, we're all together and yay, this is good. Maybe we've got hope. Now, I don't know if you guys caught it, but do you remember Pandora's box? They open it and all the plagues go out and everything. And the only thing left in the bottom of the box is hope. If people had read their Greek mythology better, they'd realize the problem with that, okay? You've already unleashed the plagues. This is a different situation. We are in a situation where we have to deal with a major pandemic. First, because even if we do the traditional tools, as far as stimulus, et cetera, which we will address going forward here today, but until we get on top of this thing, really, basically, we're just spinning our wheels. That plague is going to be connected with our economic policy. It's going to be connected with our healthcare policy, obviously. What's that thing about the Chinese character? Chaos is also opportunity. Yes. As well as almost every aspect of trying to put this state back together so it at least functions at a minimum level. Tremendous amount of potential here, but there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. And also, we're dealing with a political situation that is, fragmented. We've never had a full-blown insurrection attempt with a absolutely hostile insurrectionist party. We have now the Senate. The two senators from Georgia were a gift. And I'll have to give it, this is the difference between Obama and Biden, is that from early on, they realized that they're not going to be reaching across the aisle because what's across the aisle is almost entirely toxic. Obama was far too late to the game to realize that these people are not here to help you. They are not your friends. In fact, they're going to try and make you a one-term president.
Well, I think that's a very important point, Bryan. Let me pick up from that. I want to bring Doug back into the conversation on this. I mean, a lot there. But one is, Doug, what is your read on how the infighting, if to choose a euphemism, within the Republican Party affects the lay of the land for the Democratic Party, and particularly for, the left wing of the Democratic Party or those to the left of the Democratic Party that want to drag them left? Some of us expected, especially before the Senate became a more up for grabs situation, that, there were very cynical kind of takes, and maybe correctly cynical, suggesting, right, that, the Democrats love it, right, and Wall Street loves it when, you have a split government and so forth. So whatever progressiveness may be coming out of the House is going to get stopped before it even gets to the White House. What's your sense of the current lay of the land politically and what it means for possibilities, and particularly for the possibility of left movements pushing and pulling this administration to do some of the things that the people on the planet need? You are muted.
I had muted myself
There you go.
to be a good citizen, but here I am again. Yeah, there are a couple of things here. One is that I think the left really needs to take some credit for the good things the Biden administration is doing. It's not the Democratic Party. It is not the broader body politic of what it was, in 2008, 2009. There is a very substantial progressive force within the Democratic Party. We have people in the House, particularly the Squad, but also in state legislatures and city councils around the country who call themselves socialists. I'm sure some purists say they're not really socialists, but my God, could you have imagined that 12 years ago, that there'd be people calling themselves socialists? And we've scored a lot of points. I mean, the Green New Deal is actually on the political radar, and it's really, and that's largely because of the efforts of AOC. She's a phenomenal political presence. And with this proposal, really changed our discourse. And of course, it's really too much for the current power structure for sure. But the fact that we're even talking about this and it's really setting the agenda against which everything else has to be measured is really a remarkable accomplishment. I think we should pat ourselves in the back because we don't really have much in the way of victories to show in the last several decades. The Republican Party is just insane and toxic force. I mean, it's just it's filled with lunatics and vicious creatures, and I think really alienated a lot of people. Of course, we have people like Joe Manchin in the Senate who are effectively moderate Republicans. He might prevent any increase in the minimum wage, any serious increase in the minimum wage. The people of West Virginia desperately need a higher minimum wage, but Joe Manchin isn't on their side. But I think an awful lot of Democratic illusions about working with the Republicans have been blown up by the behavior of the Republican Party. And it looked like when Biden had them in for a chat a week or two ago, it almost looked like he was trying to say, yeah, have we tried and it's just not working? Because they made it clear afterwards they're going to go for reconciliation to pass the relief bill and not try to get Republican votes and do it, without a more conventional way. So, I mean, that's a pretty remarkable job. Also, having Bernie Sanders as chair of the Senate Budget Committee, that's, a very powerful position, and that makes a big difference as well. So the Republican Party seems very divided against itself. There are a few kind of sane people in it who actually believe in governance, but then there are just absolute raving lunatics and bigots. What is it, a dozen people? I think a dozen or so senators voted against Pete Buttigieg for transportation secretary. Pete Buttigieg has no particular expertise in transportation. They had like 12 buses in South Bend. He doesn't really know much about it. But on the other hand, the only reason they voted against him was not because of his lack of expertise in transportation. It's just because he's gay. Yeah. I mean, they're just, hopeless, irredeemable bigots and reactionaries of the worst sort. And I don't think the American public really is very fond of that. So how the Republican Party maintains its control or its considerable power still is something to behold, because they hold on to their power because of gerrymandering and voter suppression, and since they control like 2/3 of the states now completely, something like that, they're going to get to redraw the congressional districts after the Census Bureau, releases the latest 2020 census data. So that they're going to do their best to maintain their power that way, but it's quite clear that the only way they can stay in power is because the Electoral College had slaveholders' heritage, and because of gerrymandering and voter suppression. They are so visibly afraid of anything resembling democracy, and God knows, the Democratic Party is not anything to admire as a model of democratic governance, but the opposition now is just so vile and so reactionary, and there's a chance that the Democrats can actually push through some half-decent legislation without them or over them, which is a good thing. I didn't think that Biden was going to go for reconciliation. I thought he was going to try to go for getting some Republican votes for his program, but it seems like they don't want to repeat the mistakes of Obama 2009, and they don't want to see a rerun of those midterm elections. As I said at the beginning, it could be a lot worse.
Yeah, really, really interesting. I mean, you wonder if it, in ways, Biden's lack of kind of charisma as a kind of co-optive potential in the way that Obama kind of was so clearly able to kind of rally symbolic and rhetorical force. To some degree, he doesn't. Biden, partly because of the pandemic, because of the Trump years, just doesn't seem to have and his own record, right, which is so glaringly offensive to so many folks on the left. It seems, and even liberals, that it seems to be, he doesn't have that cover. I mean, it seems like there may be some vulnerability there that whether they want to or not, they have to kind of give some things at least to establish credibility right here out of the gate. But I mean, when we look at the international situation, I do wonder, how things appear differently. To what degree we see, continuity and discontinuity between the Trump administration and, frankly, the just U.S. Imperial traditions here. When we think about the international situation, I'd like to bring in Medea at this point. Medea, how does the Biden administration, the Biden regime, or for put it a different way, U.S. empire under Biden look similar or different from a kind of global perspective? What's on your radar right now in terms of things you are, the positive potential you see or dangers you see looming, and opportunities for the left to intervene in a way that would, minimize the danger and increase the potential positives?
Well, let me say from the get-go that I think one of the problems in terms of foreign policy is the weakness of the anti-war movement. And it's because of that that we haven't had more gains in the Biden cabinet. I think Doug was talking about how there were less positive things to say on the global front, and that's for sure. Most of the people are from the Obama years. It's kind of a cabal of, I would call them liberal interventionists, people like Anthony Blinken, the new Secretary of State, who is way better than Mike Pompeo, Jake Sullivan, and of course Biden himself, who supported the Iraq War. And Blinken is actually to the right of Biden because Blinken was in favor of the US intervention in Libya. He was in favor of the surge in Afghanistan that Biden was not in favor of. Some of the other picks, well, the Secretary of Defense is a general, which was a problem for many people because they thought there should be a civilian in charge of the military. But, this is a guy who also, as soon as he got out of the military, what did he do? He ran and joined the board of Raytheon. On the other hand, he is way better than the person who was seen to be the obvious pick, who was Michelle Flournoy, a real hawk, especially when it comes to China. And we were part of a strong movement that I think nixed the appointment of Michelle Flournoy and, maybe even stopped a war with China, who knows? But that's good that we don't have her. CIA, we also helped nix the appointment of a torture apologist, Mike Morell, and actually got somebody quite good as head of the CIA, given that it's the CIA who is a veteran diplomat, William Burns. Unfortunately, his boss, who is the head of all the 17 intelligence agencies, the director of national intelligence, is April Haynes, who was somebody who was called in the middle of the night under Obama to authorize drone strikes and let CIA hackers who were trying to stop the torture report from getting out, let them off the hook, redacted the torture report. So she's awful. And then just to go to some of the policy issues, I think some of the joining the international community is good. Overall, the mindset is that from the Biden administration is that U.S. has to regain its position at the head of the table, and somehow the U.S. has the right to be at the head of the table. On the positive side, rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement is a good thing. Rejoining the World Health Organization and other UN agencies is a good thing. Lifting the Muslim travel ban is good. Renewing the START treaty with Russia, although they're very big on the Cold War with Russia, is good. Then we get to some of the important issues that Biden said he was going to change, which is the U.S. support for the Saudi war on Yemen. He just came out and said U.S. was going to stop selling offensive weapons to the Saudis, but leaves a big question of what is the difference between offensive and defensive weapons. And when it comes to Iran, that's something we thought he was going to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal right off the bat. As some of the early executive orders, he's waited and waited, and things are getting a little difficult in terms of his people putting forth the idea that Iran has to meet U.S. conditions before the U.S. goes back into a deal that it defaulted on. So that's disconcerting, although two of the people that he brought into his cabinet, Rob Malley as the Iran envoy and Wendy Sherman, are both people who negotiated the Iran deal under Obama. So you think that would be good. He hasn't made moves yet on Cuba sanctions, which have been so devastating under Trump. He said he's going to study the effects of them. And of course, a lot of us are pushing that he does more than study them because people are dying in Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea. I think he's going to stay in Iraq and Afghanistan for the entire 4 years. I think he's going to up the Cold War with China, which is going to be a justification for continuing the humongous Pentagon budget. And I think Congress will continue to be a big problem in terms of stopping things like troop withdrawals and Pentagon budget cuts that we are pushing for.
Could I ask Medea a question?
Go right ahead.
Oh, do.
Yeah, we heard a lot from Democrats about all the damage that Trump did to the multilateral structures of U.S. power, notably NATO. First of all, how serious do you think that damage was? What is this? Was it as real as some people say? And second, what can he do to repair it, if that's possible, or has the U.S. position in the world just sliding inexorably?
Well, some of us might think that it's good that a lot of people and countries in the world don't see the US as a global leader anymore, especially when we can't deal with the pandemic and we can't stop an insurrection in our capital, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's good that there is a more multipolar world forming and that a lot of countries want to get away from the dollar as the only form of international finance. And that Biden wanting to rejoin some of these international agencies is good and is bad. He wants to strengthen NATO, which I think many of us would think should be dissolved. And in terms of supporting the European allies, you would think that when it came to Iran, he would quickly have rejoined to show the Europeans that he wants to get back dealing with Europe on these international issues. So I think he is trying to regain a place in the world of prominence when the world has changed.
Medea, when you were last on the show, it was shortly before the election. We had a discussion about, from a left perspective, why this election was so crucial. And of course, one of the arguments that you and others made and have made was about that, at least under even a Biden, this was after Bernie had dropped out of the race, when we had the interview, the discussion, and at least under a Biden, there's the possibility of pressure, right? That there's at least openness to at least some commitment, or at least some rhetorical commitment to listening to some of the constituents that the left cares about and is invested in, and maybe even have some power with. I wanted to now that we're on the other side of that election, to ask you kind of how the ground looks in terms of that kind of left, whether it's anti-war or other kind of progressive pressure on this administration. You mentioned already in your comment that you felt that we, or that you and groups you've been involved with, have had some role in maybe nixing a couple of appointments. I wonder, I think I can imagine our listeners and viewers would be really interested in hearing a little more, what you can say publicly. What is nixing, a potentially reactionary hawk foreign policy kind of advisor or diplomat look like? And also looking forward, what are the forms and venues in which you think those of us committed to change beyond, the imperial norm, what we should be looking at, where the pressure points are, not only in this administration, but of course in the system that it presides over?
Well, let me use Iran as an example because it's such a crucial one. And we were able to nix some of these worst appointees by PR campaigns, getting articles out about how bad they were, getting other people in the administration to speak out about them, not publicly, but privately. But we also were able to stop the right from nixing Rob Malley as the envoy to Iran. He's hated by AIPAC, by Israel. He's said to be, quote, anti-Semitic because he's met with Hamas. He's hated by the right-wing Iranians because they say he doesn't care about human rights in Iran, etc. And despite a very strong campaign that they waged against him, he was picked by Biden, and that's a very positive thing. So there is somebody on the inside that we know that we've pushed for that wants to see a deal done with Iran. On the other hand, as I mentioned, we don't see the right kind of movement on this deal. So we see the forces that we're up against Biden, it's interesting around Israel, for example, because Biden and Kamala Harris are very close to Israel, yet Biden has not called Netanyahu in all this time, where he's called all kinds of other leaders, and Netanyahu is quite pissed about it. So that's an interesting development. And I think a lot of that is around the Iran nuclear deal, the desire by Biden to lessen the support for the Saudis, to stop listening so closely to Israel, to go back into the Iran nuclear deal, and to ease some of the conflicts in the region. But it's, there's a lot of division, and I think we on the left can really push through our congressional representatives, because why the heck aren't they speaking out on Iran? Where are their voices? Why aren't they saying, come on, get back into the deal. The ball is in your court. Just rejoin. I don't see any, we've been pressuring the squad. We don't see any of them responding. So I think our job would be to get some response from Congress to get out there on this issue and say, rejoin the deal, period.
Yeah, that raises so many interesting questions. I really appreciate, how much terrain is being mapped out here by our three guests. And I do want to also mention, though, in a few minutes, we'll be welcoming our live participants. We have over 50 of you, I think, between Zoom and Facebook. So if you do have a question or comment that you'd like to make, we ask you that you do keep it brief and clear, and that you do indicate in the chat box in all caps that you'd like to speak, so we can make sure not to miss your contribution. Thanks, everybody. Let's see. So, Medea, you raised the issue of the squad, which I thought, might be an interesting issue for us to think about together, in terms of one of those tactical leverage points. Doug, maybe we could bring you in here a little bit on this. There was, of course, a whole kerfuffle. I know what you were involved in on, you couldn't avoid on Facebook regarding the force the vote question. Without going into the weeds on that and what people think of, a particular personality's YouTube personality's tone or approach. What do you see? And Bryan, I'd like to get your thoughts on this as well. About leverage points of leverage, right? This thing the left needs to think more about, right? Not only having the right ideas, the right moral critique or whatever, political critique, but what are the points of actual leverage, either in the government or in society more broadly? What do you think of this, the possible issue of leverage with the squad? Doug, and how that could be related to how that maybe is operative already. I don't know in anything that we've seen, or the way that it could be. And I'm here very cognizant of Medea's really flagging the left's lagging on issues of foreign policy. I'm not asking you to speak to that right now, but just, in what ways, what is the leverage you see, around the squad and perhaps elsewhere, maybe not as visible on social media or elsewhere, where the left could have or does have some leverage to actually verify some gains here, or at least resist some of the barbarities coming down the pike?
Yeah, it's true that I don't think the squad is very attentive to foreign policy, or not as much as they should be, and that's unfortunate. AOC in particular has been very disappointing on the Venezuela question, although she was good in Bolivia. But that controversy over the force to vote with he will not be named acted as if the only obstacle between us and Medicare for all, and that's not the problem. They're like, what? I guess their ranks have expanded somewhat with this recent election. They're now maybe 6 or 7 in the squad now, not an all-female cast anymore either. But still, that's a very small portion of a 435-member body, almost half of which is a Republican. So, the major obstacle, any kind of progressive legislation, is not whether AOC at all are pushing hard enough for it. It's the corporate Democrats and the entire Republican Party. And what we need to do is get rid of some of the deadwood Democrats. And it's very interesting, speaking of points of leverage, that this is repeating a pattern in previous election years, but I think it even more so. Chuck Schumer, now the leader of the Senate, was afraid of a primary challenge from either AOC or someone like her. And he is actually acting more friendly towards the left, being more expansive about the stimulus package and about the minimum wage and those sorts of domestic policies. He's certainly not going to change the U.S. relationship with Israel. That's not who Chuck Schumer is. But I think that threat of a primary challenge actually did seem to make Chuck Schumer into a somewhat better politician. So that's that's, I think, the points of leverage is threatening to challenge some of this deadwood in 2022, and maybe get rid of them, or at least scare them into being better. That's where I think where our point of leverage is, because having that squad in Congress, I can't. It's been decades since we had a group of people that impressive, that far left, and that popular and charismatic and effective. And that really, have changed our political discourse dramatically. And I think we should certainly not worship them or, just defer to everything they say. But it's an impressive force, and they should certainly not be attacked as obstacles to doing good. It's Joe Manchin is more of a problem right now than anyone else. Although I don't know what we can do about Joe Manchin in a state that Trump won by 40 points.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate your point about the limits of kind of blaming your allies for not being able to take power completely. It's certainly, I mean, I think it's important, right? In some ways, and I'll say his name, Jimmy Dore or whatever, but I appreciate the idea of challenging the progressives to try to really own the power that they may have. But there is that danger of always falling out of you might say, a comradely discourse into someone that mistakes a friend for an enemy. And I think that is a challenge, especially in this social media environment that consumes even in well-intended conversations. Bryan, I'd like to ask you to speak to the leverage question, if you can be. And then I think after that, we have some people leveraging the chat box to get in on this conversation as well. So, I mean, how do you see this question of leverage? And again, I mean, don't need to speak to this only in terms of government bureaucracy and the points of pressure there, but where do you see the left, the existing movements we have right now, potentially having some leverage on and around this new administration? I think you're muted. Let's make sure you can unmute there. I don't know if you were muted by a
There we go.
producer. There you go.
Let's try that again. Yeah, obviously the squad is delightful because what they do is they move the discourse. Because if not, it's going to be, completely controlled by the powers that be, per se. They're giving a lot of fresh air to ideas that need to be done. An example of this, you can talk, one of the elephant in the room right now that we really need to deal with, not only is the pandemic and the economic thing, but in order to deal with the pandemic and our economic situation, we got to deal with healthcare. And the question is, how do you do it, et cetera? And the interesting thing, and I'll bring up leverage, is that right now, the most, do we say effective, the most efficacious way of attempting to bring in a serious system of public health is one of using a reconciliation process of being able to do Medicare for all. I think it was Bernie Sanders was suggesting that everyone signs up, or as I'm automatically signed up for Medicare per se, you sign this. And it's interesting because if you look at the history of the National Health Service in England, it was literally the Blitz, the London Blitz, that gave them the national healthcare system, national health. We have a Blitz. And I was looking at the numbers here. I actually told out my calculator was doing the math. And the amount of people that died in the Blitz was something about 100? Something like 14,000. Here it is. 41,000 people were killed in the London Blitz and 139,000. Now, I read something in the Lancet today that talked about the 450,000 COVID deaths in the United States, and then looking at Trump's policies and the fact that there was no public health system that could deal with it. If 40% of those 450,000 deaths could have been averted if Trump had actually behaved like the group of seven: Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, or the UK. So we take 40% of 450,000 deaths, that's 180,000 necessary deaths. Well, if the Blitz in England, it was 40,000 dead, and that basically created the healthcare system in England. Charles Webster, the official historian of the NHS, wrote in 2002, it was the Luftwaffe that achieved in months what had defeated politicians and planners for at least 2 decades. What's the expression from Machiavelli? That never leave a good crisis unexploited. This is an example that since we've been having the powers that be undermine and block about every attempt at public health, it's time to be able to link going forward our economic policy with our health policy. And if we can do this through a reconciliation, we do it. And this needs to be done, because we can't really do anything as far as economics until we're able to get this thing taken care of.
I mean, before we go to the audience, I would like to come back to Doug on this. I mean, Doug, I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but if my memory doesn't fail me, I mean, I'm guessing, I'll guess that you were one of the folks back in the 90s that was articulating particular, outrage at and disappointment, or worse, with the Bill Clinton administration, partly because there was, in fact, at that point in time, actual significant support in the capitalist class for some version of national health care, right? And that the Clintons, and the Democrats kind of bungled and effed that up so much that even the kind of, in other words, that there are parts of the ruling class, of the capitalist class, that realize, right, that when you're spending more on healthcare than, on private healthcare and pharmaceuticals than in healthcare, health insurance plans, than you are on the steel or labor that goes into a car, that's not even in the interest of the class's kind of profitability of its commodities. I mean, this gives you a chance to circle back to that question about the liberal kind of wing of Wall Street. I mean, do you feel like, I mean, are they liberal simply because of, because of their kind of ideological commitments, or do you feel like is there a wing of even the financial capitalist class that sees like the existential crisis, that makes the connection that, in a way, Bryan was just making, that in some sense, that even if you don't give a shit about people dying, but if you just want them to buy stuff and sustain your profit margins and, take out your credit card debt and maybe have a chance of paying it back, or at least getting the government to later, that you still need some kind of Keynesian or public health intervention in the economy. I just wonder, I mean, what your read is on the kind of basis for that. I mean, is it simply that these Democrats are open to pressure because of, the situation we're in, or is it that there is some recognition, even in high places, that the crises are so existential that there needs to be a return to certain out of fashion ideas, call them Keynesian or whatever you prefer?
Well, I think, one thing that's very important to remember, and this is something that I learned from Fran Piven, who really brought it home to me, is that if you have Democrats in office, they're at least open to popular pressure in ways that Republicans are certainly not open to popular pressure. So, anything that decent that Biden does is probably more out of the result of popular pressure than anything that's coming out of the goodness of his heart. Now, I think there are people in Wall Street and in the corporate establishment who are really worried about inequality threatening social stability at this point. I think there is some concern about that. So even a couple of years ago, we saw the Business Roundtable, which is one of the pinnacle formations of American capital, saying, okay, maybe this focus on shareholder power has been overdone. We need to think about other people other than shareholders, it was pretty weak, but for the Business Roundtable, it's a big deal. We see the growing role of ESG, environmental and social governance issues, among some of the big institutional money on Wall Street. Again, they're concerned about the environment and social stability, but nothing too radical. They don't want to do anything that's going to threaten their profit margins. They do seem to be worried about inequality. We see this now coming throughout the Federal Reserve, which I gotta say, given the rot of so many American institutions, for all the problems of the Federal Reserve as a class institution, at least it's still run by intelligent, competent people, which is you can't say for very much of the rest of the American establishment. And there's a lot of concern there about climate. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco held a conference on climate last year. Some of the other central banks around the world seem to be concerned about climate risk to financial stability. So, we're seeing a dawning of consciousness in that area. But again, they don't want to do anything that's going to threaten their class power. So Leo Panitch, who died a couple of months ago, a good friend of mine, great political thinker, he and Sam Gindin interviewed the CEO of GM sometime in the 90s. I can't remember exactly what year it was. And he said, they said to the CEO of GM, you have a lot of operations in Canada. You know that you save money. You're spending so much money health insurance in the US. And that was, 20, 25 years ago. They're spending even more now. So why don't you, want to adopt the Canadian system here? And the CEO of GM said, we don't want to create another entitlement. He had real class consciousness, and giving an inch on something like that, the capitalist class correctly sees that if you give something to the proles, they're going to want more. You want them constantly ill at ease, constantly, nervous about their position in life. So I think they're stuck in this contradiction where they're concerned about social stability as a result of polarization and growing impoverishment. I just saw a paper that showed that we hear a lot about spatial inequality, the growth of geographic polarization. But, the standard idea is just the rich coasts and the busted heartland. But in fact, if you look at it at a county level, poverty rates have been equalizing across the country. What's different is that we have these little enclaves where the affluent have been sheltering themselves, and then the rest of the country is having trouble getting by. So, there are these like geographical tensions, there are these social tensions, this growing polarization, and I think it's dawning on the capitalists, or the more enlightened ones, not the petty bourgeois ones who are like the root of a lot of the Republican Party, but the big ones know that something needs to be done, but they're afraid of giving too much because that would threaten their rule. So they're in this difficult situation where they want to give just the right amount to keep things from falling apart, but not too much where the proles may want their scalps.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Frederick Douglass's narrative, which I'm teaching in a class at UMass Boston, and he overhears, a master basically saying, if you give them an inch, they'll take an L, which I think is still, a contradiction that restrains and frustrates the rulers. We got to find a way to take advantage of that. Okay, let's bring in some of the masses here. I'm not going to characterize you all any beyond that. We have a number of folks that want to ask questions. Some of them have indicated they'd like me to ask it, and some that they want to ask themselves. I'm going to go to 3 folks that I believe can speak for themselves here. Michael Passerini, we'd like to start with you. I understand you have a question for Medea. Then we'll go to, maybe we can take 3 at a time if people can keep their questions relatively brief. We'll go to Linda, one of the co-producers of Shelter in Solidarity, and then we will bring in Paul Horowitz. Michael?
Hi. I have a question for you, Medea. There's a viewpoint I've come to in the last couple of years regarding the Iran deal, which is quite provocative, but I think it's reasonable. Initially, I was very supportive of the Iran deal, and I was right up until I think maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago. And the reason I've changed my mind, and I just want your opinion on this, the reason I've changed my mind is because I just think the Iran deal is so blatantly unfair to Iran. I'm no supporter of nuclear weapons or nuclear deterrence, but the fact that we're making all these demands of Iran and basically forcing them not to develop their own nuclear deterrent, which is pretty much the main reason I mean, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but the main reason we're doing it is to ensure that Israel has a monopoly on a nuclear deterrence in the Middle East. I believe that Iran should leave the deal, and I think honestly, people need to come to the just face the truth that, or even if Iran developed nuclear weapons, it would be like North Korea. They're going to develop them, they're going to probably sit in a warehouse for 20 years, and then they'll be destroyed after there's some arms agreement like the New START treaty. I mean, that's my view. So I wondered what your response would be to that.
Thank you, Michael. Let's take a couple more, and then and we can just keep track of those, Medea. There's lots to respond to there. Linda.
Okay, hi. So I guess this question is for all 3 of our guests. I'm wondering how you think education will fare under the Biden administration, particularly given the big campaign promises that he and Kamala Harris made about student loan forgiveness and also free public and community colleges for middle-class households.
Great, important question, dear to many of us educators on the call, and as well as those who have folks in or will be in college sometime. And then last but not least for now, we'll have Paul Horowitz. Paul, you there?
Yes, thank you. So I wanted to ask a question. I'll start, to pose it to Medea, but to all the panelists in a way. So, on foreign policy, there's very important things to talk about with regard to Iran or Yemen, Palestine, Cuba, China, et cetera. But beyond, all those particulars, we're kind of in a new world. And I was wondering how we on the left might articulate the underlying principles that should guide our foreign policy, both political and economic. And some are kind of obvious, like non-intervention, especially opposition to military intervention. And in a vague way, multilateralism, though, of course, it's fine in the abstract, but, other governments are also in the pockets of local or multinational capital. So multilateralism also has its limits. But what about like human rights as a concept? Is that real, or is that always a prop to excuse American hegemony and, justify American intervention? What about trade? What should we be saying about trade? What would constitute fair ground rules for a global economy among nations that are at such different levels of economic development? To sort of open up this conversation about foreign policy, not just about Biden, but in this moment, but sort of slightly longer term.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Paul. It's easy when we're dealing with the actually existing regime to limit our, kind of discussion to things we think are possible and not what really ought to be. So I appreciate that. So let's go, Medea. I think at least two of those questions were kind of loaded with foreign policy references. The question about the Iran, the way in which the Iran nuclear deal looks different when you remember that Israel is the only power in the Middle East with nuclear weapons right now that we know of, and we do know it. And then also this question that Paul has raised about foreign policy issues. And then after that, maybe we'll bring in everyone for the education and debt question. Medea?
So on the issue of the Iran nuclear deal, I've been to Iran several times in recent years, and I find that the more progressive, the more secular Iranians really want the nuclear deal because they want decent relations with the US. They want the sanctions lifted. They think the sanctions strengthen the hardliners, the right, the militarists inside Iran. It breeds a lot of corruption. And so they're really anxious, and they were delighted when Obama helped to sign the Iran deal in 2015. So my sense is that it's good for the Iranian people, it's good for politics in Iran, and the hardliners who want to just not negotiate with the West are not the kind of people who would support more liberal social values that I think most of us would be in favor of. In terms, and a good piece that I'll put in the chat that came out in The Guardian just a few days ago was Bishop Tutu from South Africa calling out the Biden administration to say, you should do what you are legally responsible for doing, which is to call out and recognize Israel's nuclear weapons and stop supporting economically Israel because it is a proliferator. It is the proliferator of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. Just great to see it out there. And then in terms of, what should be the overall view, I mean, I like to say that it's not the US at the head of the table, it's a round table where we are discussing these issues as one nation among many. An end certainly to US unilateral interventions and military interventions for sure, an end to political meddling. And, we have somebody at the head of AID, Samantha Power, who championed a very dangerous viewpoint of humanitarian interventionism that we have to stop, and an end to economic blackmail. And I would say that the way the sanctions have been used as a form of coercion has really been a form of economic blackmail. And I think Doug can speak more directly to what kind of trade policies we should have.
Thanks, Medea. Doug, would you like to step into that? And of course, we can bridge into the question about education, debt, public funding of universities and colleges as well. Doug?
Well, yeah, actually, it's been a long time since I thought about trade issues. Takes me back to a different decade. So yeah, I really am not quite sure what to say about that. so much of what is negotiated under trade is actually all about protecting the investment rights of multinational corporations, and not really much about trade. I would say kind of related to all this is the relationship with China, which is partly framed as a trade issue, but in fact is mostly about its growing role as a rival to the United States as a political and economic power. China is no longer, the cheap workshop of the world. They're developing a lot of their own technology and becoming increasingly rival to Silicon Valley, which is of great concern. And I think we're going to see Biden, lay off Trump's visceral racism. I mean, it's so clear that Trump just hates Chinese people and hates Latin Americans. I mean, it's just so obvious the way he said the words. But I think the rivalry with China, which is partly framed as a trade issue, is really just the growth of China as a rival to the United States economically and politically. At the same time, the United States is eroding and looking kind of pathetic and weak in a lot of cases. I just wanted to say on the nuclear question, sometimes, and this is a perverse point of view, but I sometimes think every country should have nuclear weapons. Why should any country be denied that? And the fact is that the United States would have destroyed North Korea had North Korea not had nuclear weapons. The United States destroyed North Korea in the early 50s, there were millions of people killed, which most Americans have no idea of. And this is why the North Koreans are very paranoid about the U.S. They have long memories and are justifiably afraid of what the United States will do to them because it happened once before. So, if you have nuclear weapons, the United States can't push you around. So I think, there's something to be said for, saying that Iran should have nuclear weapons, because then the United States couldn't push them around, or Israel, which has, anywhere between 100 and 400 nuclear weapons, depending upon whose estimates you listen to. So it's
Can I just intervene to say the solution is not more nuclear weapons. The solution is getting rid of nuclear weapons, and that's why
I think that's really a
treaty at the UN that we should be supporting.
Yeah, I think that seems like once the cat is out of the bag, it's kind of hard to imagine putting it back in. But that's a long conversation. The phrase human rights makes me think of Samuel Moyn's argument that human rights came to the fore as a political issue as the world was getting more and more unequal. And it was something that appealed to a lot of liberals because it made them seem like they had a conscience. But all the material fates of the world were polarizing massively as the income distribution around the world got more unequal in the neoliberal era, China being the great exception to that. But yeah, so this human rights discourse should be looked at rather skeptically, just because it seems like a high-minded way of dismissing any attempt towards questioning the global distribution of resources. On the education question, well, certainly what's coming is better than the world of Betsy DeVos. She was just one of the more horrible members of the Trump administration, just an absolutely horrific political force. More broadly, her family is a terrible political force, and she was a terrible force in education. So it's nice to be delivered of that. I'm expecting we'll see probably some moves toward student debt forgiveness, but not what some people would like. I think we'll probably see moves towards making higher education more affordable, but certainly not the kind of free education that Bernie Sanders was talking about in the campaign. I think education should be free from kindergarten or preschool rather to PhD or beyond. But that's not on the the serious people's agenda at this point. But it's certainly an improvement over like everything else. This is going to be improvement over what went before, but it's certainly going to be short of what we'd like in our dreams.
Yeah, well said, Doug. And I want to make a comment on the education point as someone who works and struggles on that front quite often. But Bryan, would you like to add something? I know both those three questions got quite a bit of response there, but would you like to add anything to that round?
Okay, quick in on trade is that we're not going back to the previous trade regime. That cargo ship has sailed and sunk. Okay, so what you're seeing now is kind of attempting to refit something looking like a global supply chain, but it's going to be on different rules. Look for regional trading blocks in particular, South America in particular, Mercosur increasing its power per se, but also with China in Asia, China, South Asia, Africa et al. China will be asserting itself a little bit better as such, but we're not going back to that. And yeah, it is a geopolitical thing, as per se, and this is going to be an interesting proposition, very touch and go for a while. For education, obviously, the low-hanging fruit right now for people that are hurting, particularly people that are carrying student debt, is what is it? You can't get blood from a stone. You have to acknowledge the reality that a large amount of people are stressed as far as their incomes, whether it's employment at all. And paying money in student loans and taking that out of circulation is madness, absolute madness when it comes to attempting to stabilize economy at a time of pandemic. Now, with that said, the student loan system is madness, even at a time with blue skies and unicorns, etc. It's insane. So I think the idea is that it's one of those things. Remember that biblical concept of a jubilee? There was a reason for that, because when you have this accumulated debt and entire parts of the population can't get out of that debt, it's time for a jubilee. So
Absolutely.
I don't care what you're going to call it, but just respect the reality of it. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you're reminding me, Bryan, of another late comrade we've lost in recent months or years. Time is such a blur. But David Graeber, right, in his book,
love Graeber.
Debt, the First 5,000 Years, right? I mean, one of my big takeaways from that book was that he said that there had never been a society in human history, to his knowledge, that had a situation where the poor owed the rich so much without one of three things then occurring: either a jubilee, although it's better if you put that one last, it's more exciting, but
exactly.
Return to actual slavery, right, or a total social meltdown, right. So
torches and pitchforks,
right. So I mean, yeah, it seems to me, I mean, they're not talking about, they're still talking about having the federal government pay back those loans. The point I wanted to make on education, just to be on a soapbox for one moment, is that we need to talk about affordability and push for affordability and, and freezing and lowering tuition, but we need to keep our eye on educational quality. Right, there are a lot of folks that talk the language of affordability when it comes to public university or college, but what they're really talking about is turning our research universities, which are able to give working class people at least a shot at the quality of a liberal arts education and deep dive into knowledge and research skills and exposure to the front line of thought in our society, and turn them into more like community colleges where you have 30 people in a classroom for first year writing, and there's no ability, or it's very, very difficult, right, to actually achieve the depth of inquiry. And more in lines, and nothing against community colleges, which are incredible places with incredible people, but against all odds, that we need to keep an eye on not only, I would just argue, not only the affordability and question at the level of tuition, but the full public funding that can allow us to get beyond choosing between affordability and quality, right, which for public higher ed. Sorry to get on my soapbox for a moment there. But so much on the table here, including a few more questions in the chat box. I believe we have Kira, one of our co-producers of Shelter in Solidarity. Let's take three at a time as well. I believe we have Bill Moyer, whose question was overlooked earlier. Sorry about that, Bill. We're asking everyone to keep their questions or comments as brief as possible without losing your particular verve. And also, I had one other, I can't forget Joe Nevins, a frequent commentator and guest on Shelter in Solidarity. We'll go to Joe third. First to Kira.
All right, thank you, Joe. So listening to another one of my favorite podcasts besides Behind the News and all, I was listening to an interview with Patrick Bond, someone who I think many of us already know and admire. And he was talking about, with regards to Biden's plan, something called a global ecological debt. How can we be pushing the Biden plans, the Thrive Agenda and the Green New Deal to be addressing this ecological debt?
Great, Kira, taking that debt concept in another direction. Really interesting. Bill Moyer, and then Joe.
Yeah, building on that. And of course, I would love to get all obsessed about and talk about and preach about railroads as the path towards our new society, but I'm going to resist that and ask Doug a question about, and the other panelists. Hi, Medea. We recently hosted a series on modern monetary theory, and I tell you, I really love the idea that you can balance an economy, that you balance a society. That part of it really appeals to me. I don't know where I stand on the rest of the concepts, and I can't honestly claim that I fully understand it. But I do observe something that does concern me, and that's the possibility that we're setting up obsessions and infighting within the left against folks like public banking or move the money efforts who want to defund Pentagon and other programs, with folks who say, no, we don't have to do that. We just need to fund everything. So I just a little bit on how can we navigate this emergent theory and its potential, and keep it from dividing us as we try to apply our values to the society that is emerging. Thank you very much, Chuck.
Okay, thanks, Bill. And then we go to Joe Nevins for the third question.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks to all our guests for a really great discussion. It's been really helpful. My question is, if I heard Bryan correctly, I heard him say something to the effect that we can't deal with the economy until we deal with healthcare. What I'm wondering is if we can ever deal with the economy, but what I mean by that is achieving some sort of significant degree of economic justice and security for the masses without addressing the massive amount of US military spending. In that regard, I'm wondering what openings, if any, the guests see for putting the Pentagon on a diet in the name of creating a more socioeconomically just and secure United States. And it seems like people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are making more noise about this than they have in the past. And now there's a defense spending reduction caucus in the House, small, but it's new. I'm just wondering, Medea, perhaps you're the best person to speak to this, but I like, all of you, what is this meaningful? This noise that seems new vis-a-vis Pentagon's, it's sort of like the ultimate sacred cow. And finally, it seems like we see it on the margins, some willingness to challenge that sacred cow.
Okay, we have a lot here on the table. I'm not going to try to summarize each of the questions. We get a question about the ecological debt, a broader question about the state of the left and the kind of either or versus yes and kind of approach, and then this question Joe just articulated. Let's just go in the order that we began. Doug, Bryan, and Medea.
Oh, okay, thank you. First of all, I just wanted to say, as a footnote to the Jubilee question, I believe Pat Robertson, when he ran for president in 1988, suggested that we should have a Jubilee year. And this attracted an outrage editorial from the Wall Street Journal, but kind of weird where that, considering the source of that, but I guess it's biblical and inspiration. The issue of an ecological debt, I think that's a very important question. Patrick's an old friend of mine, and I've been talking to him about these sorts of things for years. My friend Tom Athanasiou wrote a good bit of the Sanders ecological plan, his version of the Green New Deal during the campaign, and a very large component of that, which didn't get very much attention, was that the US and other rich countries owe a lot of money to the poor countries of the world, because we kind of fill the air with carbon, and now we're asking them to tighten their belts carbon-wise, and this kind of ecological reparations as a way paying the rich countries of the world, paying the poor countries of the world to reduce their carbon emissions and develop a clean economy. So I think any kind of Green New Deal would have to be global in scope, can't be just a domestic US obsession, but would also have to have that international dimension of something like reparations or subsidies for the poorer countries of the world to come up with clean economies. And Bill Moyer's question, I haven't forgotten you, Bill. I'm going to get back to you on the railroad question, but I just had a couple of deadlines the last few days and I haven't been able to get to it. I wrote a long piece for Jacobin last year, 8,500 words, on what I think is wrong with modern monetary theory. So anybody who wants to know what I think about modern monetary theory, look that up. I would just say in the context of this discussion that it is a way of evading a whole lot of complicated distributional issues and class conflict, things we can just print the money or create money out of thin air with keystrokes, and we don't have to raise taxes. I understand the appeal of it, but it's a way that doesn't challenge the dominant discursive dominant discourse around fiscal politics that has prevailed since the Reagan years, everyone is so afraid to raise taxes. And I'm afraid to say that if we want a civilized welfare state, we're not be able to fund it just by taxing the rich or cutting the Pentagon budget. Cutting the Pentagon budget would be a great favor to humanity. It's a disgraceful, grotesque waste of resources, and a threat to life on a vast scale. But 2 or 3% of GDP could be taken out of that. And if we wanted a Scandinavian style welfare state, we need 15 to 20% more of GDP. So this is a small down payment on it. Taxing the rich could maybe give us another 5%, but we'd still have to raise taxes on the upper middle class and some of the middle class. And that's really just a fiscal reality that a lot of people on the left don't want to face. So yeah, I'm all for cutting the military budget deeply, but for humane reasons, not because it's going to be a big piggy bank. We could finance a whole lot of other social programs with it.
Really interesting, Doug. I appreciate that. Bryan, let's go to you next.
I'll dive in here. Okay, on the ecological debt thing, and appreciate Patrick Bond's material too. Connect that to climate. We used to kick the can down the road as this is lovely, but we can't do this now because this. It's always the excuse you can't do. We've run out of road. We've run out of road dealing with climate. We've run out of road as far as species. We've run out of road in a finite world through expansion, etc. We're in a situation that it is compelling, and it has to be dealt with now. I mean, we can kind of turn your nose up at John Kerry as far as climate change, but I think that he's one guy who might actually be taking this quite seriously. But we need to keep the pressure on and think about this thing truly globally, because the amount of species being lost, the destruction of rainforest at all is bad. You're talking collapse of fisheries, collapse of everything. This is really, really bad. This is stuff I don't like to talk about my kids because I don't want to give them nightmares. Also, when I do lectures with senior facilities, I don't want to talk about this because that gives them nightmares too. All right. Debt and MMT. It's amazing that the responsible folks at the Treasury and at the Federal Reserve Bank realize that there's times like these you run deficits. And the first people that start, saying, well, we got to be responsible for this, whether we cut it back, etc., Austerians, whether they be very, very hostile, or even within a thing. This is not the time to start worrying about your deficits per se, especially in a time like this. Okay. And looking at the Biden plan right now, you got a $1.9 trillion program. That's still not enough. Okay. You got, what is it? 750 for COVID containment and vaccination, 800 billion directly to family, 600 billion directly to families, 400 billion to aid for vulnerable households and aid to businesses. Well, folks, this is a start. It's not enough. Most immediately, the GDP is taking a dip, and there's some regional economies as far as states that are getting hit. You're going to need a substantial amount of block grants. And the block grants is because the tax revenues of states and municipalities are getting clobbered. We're talking about education. Okay. Canceling debt is, student loan, that's low hanging fruit. But we also have to make sure that at elementary and all the way up, that the funding is there. When you start having states, especially with balanced budget amendments, they find that they're going to have to start cutting. You need to have a system of block grants out there until we're out of the woods as far as the pandemic. I don't see that right now. That better be coming. That should be the other shoe that's going to be dropping as such. I like railroads. I really like railroads. Now, the thing is Joe Biden likes railroads. Now, some people may growl at the name Musk, but I like a good Hyperloop here and there. I teach urban and regional and transportation economics, et cetera, and it makes sense as far as where we're going, as far as growth, to have a integrated system of public transportation that works. Unfortunately, at the time of pandemic, we have a perverse effect where the very public transportation we have can't afford to pay for itself because no one's riding it. Okay, so we have a situation that you have to think and back to block grants. How are you going to take existing infrastructure and make sure it doesn't belly up because we have no riders? And then going forward, where do we want to get? We got $1 trillion plus also of infrastructure that hasn't been touched. Roads, bridges, etc. We can green it, and we can build it, and we can rebuild it. What is it? Rebuilding it better? Okay, this can happen, but we can't do it really as far as boots on the ground. We can plan it now, but boots on the ground is going to happen when we start getting this under control. Cut the Pentagon. I have a very simple proposition, and that is just audit the damn thing. If you can actually tell me where that money goes and what pockets, where, this is a step in the right direction. But I think way back, politicians is a great thing. Oh, yeah, we'll audit the Pentagon. Do it. And then ask yourself a simple question. How safe do you feel? This is a massive budget. How safe is this? You have to really rethink, what a defense system is. Because what you're doing is you're spending billions and billions of dollars for a war that we're not fighting, and an adversary that's different than what we traditionally have. You have to rethink this entirely.
Yeah, Brian, I think that's a great closing point there. I mean, as apparently Biden's planning to mobilize a whopping 1,000 soldiers or something to administer the vaccine. But if there's ever been, I don't know that there's ever been a bigger living example of how the so-called defense budget is not actually prepared to defend the people against the actual threats. I don't know. And if an anti-militarism, anti-war spending movement can't be built out of that, I don't know what will. I mean, of course, apparently, the killing of millions of people abroad doesn't seem to stick in the American memory for long outside of the activist movement. We have 3 questions that have been posed. 2 are from folks who've asked me to pose them, and 1 is from one of our producers, Mark Soderstrom. I'm going to quickly. I'm sorry, Medea. I jumped in and then I forgot. Go to you. My bad. Excuse me.
No, sorry. I just want to say that thank you, Joe, for asking about what movement is happening, and it's very exciting actually. And I put some links in the chat. There is for the first time last year, we actually had an amendment calling for a 10% cut in the Pentagon. We used to, if we got 10 people in Congress, that would be great. This time we got 93, which is important. And we had Barbara Lee introduce a bill that she didn't push, but it was important symbolically to say, cut the Pentagon in half, cut $350 billion. So there is this Pentagon Budget Reduction Caucus. And on next Tuesday, we're going to have a meeting, an online meeting I put that in the chat too, with the 2 co-chairs of that caucus, Barbara Lee and Mark Pocan, to talk about precisely how we can build that. And you mentioned that Elizabeth Warren has actually been one of the people during the campaign that was very specific on this and said, cut the overseas contingency budget, which is now $74 billion. It's a slush fund for war. That would be an easy cut. Cut the Space Force, cut the bases overseas, bases at home, the over $1 trillion for the next 30 years for modernizing nuclear weapons. There's lots of things to cut, and I put a guide to cutting that would come up to over $500 billion that we at Cook Pink have come up with. I also added that into the chat. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Medea. And sorry again for jumping the gun there. Just eager to get to our other.
Can I ask Medea how many people are in that caucus?
Well, it's actually a secretive caucus. It's so weird. There's 17 people in it so far, but they haven't come out. You can't find it online. You can't find what it stands for, except it will stand for the 10% cut. But we have been pushing them to really make a big deal of this caucus. And that's why we have the call on Tuesday.
All right, really interesting stuff here. We had 2 questions, which I think can be put pretty briefly. One from Brittany in the chat box, who is in a place she wants to have me ask it. What about housing policy? I mean, we're on the verge of a housing crisis. I mean, there's been various forms of housing crises we've been living with for quite some time, but with evictions, rent coming due and eviction moratoriums up in the air, and and certainly temporary at best. What about Biden and the prospects for housing? Housing justice, housing stability for folks. A question from co-producer Tim. What about the possibility of statehood for Puerto Rico or for DC? I know one of the things that's come out of this Trump these Trump years has been an increased consciousness about the kind of reactionary nature of and the kind of historically racist nature, really, of and slavocrat nature of the Electoral College and the ways in which these inequalities are written right into our Constitution. What about getting Puerto Rico or DC statehood and how that might change the equation? And the third question is from Mark Soderstrom, who will ask it himself.
Thank you so much. This has been a really fascinating conversation and spanning so much material. We're looking at the necessity of reorganizing trade globally, the necessity of addressing change, the necessity of beginning to address the pandemic, which is more and more likely not going to go away entirely, even with a vaccine. We're facing an endemic change. In all of these, fundamentally reorganize, and I'm wondering what you think the future of work and labor is going to be looking like with these factors. I mean, how can we go back to work? And I'd also be interested to know your opinions are there going to be really fundamental differences between Biden, the low-hanging fruit is Trump, of course, but between Biden and Obama? Is Biden going to approach these issues and work issues differently than Obama did in his time in office? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for a wonderful evening.
Thanks, Mark. Let's go. Medea, let's go to you first on these questions. Let's go reverse order here, and then Medea, Bryan, Doug.
Well, I'll just take on the one of DC statehood because it's something near and dear to me living in DC. And just as we're having this tonight, there is a town hall with Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton to talk about how to push DC statehood for real during this time. Her bill has a huge support. I mean, it's got like 230 Congress people and 39 in the Senate. Of course, they're all Democrats. But I think this is the year to really push for DC statehood. And I'm very excited about the possibilities.
It's great. Bryan?
I agree. DC statehood is a low-hanging fruit. It's one of those, the time has come. And if you look at the numbers and you look at some other states like Wyoming, I mean, taxation without representation, what's more American than that? We'll deal with that. Housing crisis, this is going to blow up. It's going to blow up already because what you saw was sort of a secular movement since the 2008 crisis. The big housing bubble, it blows up. Once it settles, what happens is that, once burned, twice shy. You don't go into owning, you go into renting. So what you have is a housing stock which was blew up because of cheap money and a lot of building, et cetera. And then you have corporate interests that are now getting into the landlord business, the slumlord business. And what's happened is that now you've got a lot of people who can't pay those rents with a very aggressive landlords demanding said rents. This is going to blow. And also the thing now, you have a situation where people need to have stable residences to deal with a pandemic. And you have approaching homelessness at a scale you haven't seen since the Great Depression in the 30s. This is like Dust Bowl kind of shit we're going to be talking about. You go to West Coast, you go to LA, you go to the areas around there, you take a look at the situation there. And the rents are coming due. And if there is no relief to keep people in their homes, this is a problem. You try dealing with this pandemic when people are homeless, a disaster. So hopefully we have a Secretary of Housing that doesn't nap for 4 years, and we can move this forward. But this too, put the money where the mouth is, because this is going to be really important that people can shelter in place without being evicted. The other thing, work going forward. I saw something today, look up The Guardian today, about in Silicon Valley, in that particular area, work is now fundamentally changed because of pandemic at all. We're talking about 3-day weeks, but most of it's telecommuting. So what you see here is that the high-end skilled will be lessening its moving toward, commuting to the CBD per se, to maybe 3 days a week. The rest is going to be telecommuting. but people farther down the food chain, the precariat et al., are still going to be required to expose themselves to the pandemic and have to work accordingly. Work is fragmented, and the traditional jobs that died a little while ago, but it's only catching up to it. The income distribution that's pulling apart is because now we have an entire generation of people that there really is no gainful employment for. Service sector employment is really problematic, and this is the direction they're heading in. So this is a crisis that is also revealing itself going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Bryan. Doug?
I saw a comment in the chat that economics is not a science, which I'd agree with, but it puts me in mind of a comment from Joan Robinson, the great economist who should have gotten the Nobel but didn't. She said that economics likes to think of itself as the hardest of the social sciences, but next to physics, it's like astrology, which may be an insult to astrology, actually. But, I think the scientific pretensions of economics need to be taken with many grains of salt. I just want to make a clarification that when I was saying about modern monetary theory earlier, I'm not worried about deficits or taxes now. In an emergency like this, you don't think twice. You just run deficits and print money if necessary. But I'm thinking about if we ever return to more normal times, then that's when we need to start thinking about how we're going to finance a more civilized state. On the housing question, I really know nothing about Marcia Fudge, the designate for HUD. A problem is that real estate is a big Democratic constituency, business constituency. So there will be limits on things that Biden administration can propose. It depends on the pressure that comes from activists and members of Congress or friends in Congress. But it's going to be a problematic area. And yes, Brian's right about the stresses that people falling behind on rent, the threat of evictions, which are somewhat in suspension because of various eviction moratoria, although landlords are ignoring a lot of those. But still, it's keeping a lid on the crisis. But should those expire, there's going to be an awful lot of people behind on rent with massive arrears, and it's going to, I don't know how we're going to fix this problem. It's very, very difficult. On the issue of work, all this talk of robots replacing everyone, I really think that's overdone. We've been hearing that for decades, and the robots haven't taken over yet. And the work from home question, I really wonder, everybody's saying this is permanent. I'm not quite convinced that this kind of work from home thing is going to be, at least for, the knowledge worker class, going to be a permanent innovation. There's an awful lot of reasons why people gathered in offices. Having social relationships are really important to being productive. And there's certainly a lot of waste of time and annoying things that go on in offices. But on the other hand, the kinds of social relationships that people develop in the workplace are very important to, being productive. And that the whole work from home arrangement is sort of running on the fumes of those previously existing arrangements, but those are going to get, the fumes will run out. And I'm not sure that this belief that people can be permanently dispersed out of offices and cities. The reason that cities exist is that they are great economic engines to bring people together. And I'm not sure that the virtual can replace that. Finally, on the DC and Puerto Rico statehood questions, I know this is a very controversial issue in Puerto Rico, so I really don't want to weigh in on it. But I think statehood for both these jurisdictions are a real red line to the Republican Party. They would be impossible for them to it's impossible to imagine them taking 2 more Democratic senators or 4 more Democratic senators. It would really weaken Republican strength in the Senate, and they're since it probably would require a substantial bit of Republican approval to get through, it's hard to imagine they'll ever agree to it. There's that question, but also the racism. They do not like DC is full of Black people, and Puerto Rico is full of Puerto Ricans, and Republicans are not very fond of either group of people. So it's hard to imagine them welcoming these jurisdictions as 2 new stars in the American flag.
Really interesting, and I see Medea responding in the chat box on the question of the political viability of the DC statehood. I actually, our producers had mentioned a week ago we would actually like to do a show on the DC statehood question, perhaps at some point, including getting into some of the detailed politics of this. It seems important. I don't know, Medea, do you want to speak to that right out loud? I know those of us who are live are able to see your comment, but do you want to speak to that, the question of the politics of the DC statehood?
Well, I know that the DC statehood movement was really upset with Obama when in the first 2 years he did not push that. And now is the time to push it when there's Democratic control in both houses.
Yeah.
What kind of margin does it need? Does it need a 2/3 margin, or could they block it with a filibuster? I think it'd be really hard to get it through the Senate at this point.
Well, that goes to the whole filibuster issue, but that's what, folks are pushing for.
So as we are just cracked over the 8:30 line, we do like to try to wrap these shows up around 90 minutes. Sometimes we go a bit longer. And I wanted to make a brief comment and then put a final question to our great panel that has been leading this discussion. And the question I'd like to ask you is about where you see, just kind of bringing us back to ourselves and where we're at in our organizations and movements and affinity groups and all that stuff, the people side. What's your evaluation and assessment of where our movements are at right now relative to where they need to be to force or create the kind of change that we want to see? That what things that may not be quite possible. What's the state of our movements, and what can people who are on this call, who are watching the show, kind of do right now? What would you maybe bump up on the priority list? There's no shortage of things to be done, but what would you offer folks by way of advice or by way of flagging issues or opportunities that you see as particularly relevant? One that I want to mention before giving you a moment to think is, this question. I mean, I think we should do a show on like how are production chains and work relations going to be transformed coming out of this COVID crisis and nationally, locally, internationally, and getting deep into this is something I think all of you could contribute to. But one thing was thinking in my head about, is this COVID crisis in the United States perhaps changing potentially the politics of taxation? I mean, Doug, you opened the show, you refused to kind of just dive into the Biden administration first. You talked about the economy and this radical polarization you mentioned, and the kind of the way you can have wage gains in one sector, but actually kind of a growing number of even uncounted unemployed folks. Bryan, you've alluded to like a whole generation and sectors of folks for whom there is the kind of idea of a steady full-time job seems like a fantasy. I mean, is it possible that this COVID, it certainly seems possible, but how likely do you think it is that this COVID crisis can in fact create new terms for the notion of solidarity and make a kind of politics of progressive taxation more possible? I mean, Doug, as you point out, it's not enough to just go after the super rich and the Pentagon, as you put it, to kind of address the social welfare state we'd like to have, perhaps. How do you see this? I'd be curious to hear you say, you don't have to speak to this now, but how the COVID crisis may be affecting the politics of, or the potential politics of progressive taxation. But I'm not asking you to speak to that unless you want to. I would like to ask you, however, to speak to your assessment of the movement and maybe what you think people could be or should be doing right now to help build that movement to where it needs to be. Doug, can I go to you first? And then
yeah, sure. I just looked it up. It requires a majority vote in both houses to admit a new state, but the filibuster is always the problem. So that would be the nut to crack. Who knows if what's going to happen with that? As I said when this crisis first hit us, that the COVID crisis was really like a cruise missile aimed at the heart of so many fissures in American society: income, polarization, geographical polarization, the decline of state capacity, our ridiculous healthcare finance system, and not just healthcare, in the sense of going to the doctor, but also the public health system is just a total disaster. How hospitals are located in the wrong places, tending to the wrong kinds of clients, the absolute erosion of the CDC as an institution, and similar, bodies in the states, also public health departments in states and cities have been eroded very badly. So all these decades of austerity in the humane side of the state have really taken a toll. So, this crisis revealed all these things, the intense social polarization and fraying of the social fabric in the United States. So I thought that it was a perfect time to propose a radically social democratic agenda, a big, Green New Deal with both the climate side and the redistributionist side, investing in a green infrastructure, and not just building airports and roads like the old way of doing things, but a new way of doing things with clean energy, clean transportation, clean manufacturing. Is perfect opportunity. And that moment, we've had some economic recovery, but there's still an awful lot, a long way to go, and all these structural problems have not been addressed at all. So in many ways, the politics of the present moment are really amenable to the kind of agenda that would please most of the people on this call. And a lot of the movements, I'm in DSA, I'm a pretty enthusiastic member of DSA, and I think we're doing a pretty good job, especially at the local level. We're doing a lot of great work in New York City and New York State, electing people to state legislatures. We're going to probably have some people in the city council in New York City next year. So a lot of good stuff. The state of the movements going on right now is the most encouraging it's been in decades and decades. And the fact that we can talk about socialism in polite company is just the most remarkable development that in modern times. So that's very good. I think what's missing is a point that Medea made earlier, that there's just no anti-war movement to speak of. There's really little sense of challenging U.S. imperialism from the inside, and that's the biggest gift we can give to the rest of the world, is having the U.S. take its boot off people's necks, and we're not really pushing in that area. We're doing very encouraging things in the domestic side, but really there's not a whole lot going on in the international side. So I think that's the real deficiency. And we have, people have to be a little more selfless with that. We have, for most Americans, what our military does doesn't really matter to them. And we need to actually, develop some empathy for the people at the other end of our rifles.
Yeah, Doug, thank you so much for that. I mean, you make many great points very quickly, but one of them is, expanding the range of what can be spoken in public, and making, like, changing the kind of center of gravity of the conversation, making socialism a term that can be used, that matters, right? That shifting the terms of the debate, which the left has done in many ways, is a substantial contribution. But also, raise this question of the limitations of the left in terms of the foreign policy aspect. And we have this incredible anti-police brutality movement. You just mentioned, take the boot off the neck, and I can't help but think of George Floyd and the knee on the neck. To what degree can we, can this anti-police violence movement become an military violence movement? It seems like it's logically just a couple, it's just a step or two down the road, but it seems organizationally we have some work to be done. Enough for me. Let's go to Medea.
Let me just make two quick points about that. First of all, according to Gallup, 10% of American adults participated in a Black Lives Matter demonstration last summer. That's a remarkable number. So that's just really moving to me and inspiring.
Yeah.
And something like 60% of the people arrested at the Capitol were military veterans. So there's some point to be made about the U.S. military's activities returning to bite us with the violence that the institution creates and perpetrates.
Yeah, it makes the organizing of anti-war veterans, that group Iraq Veterans Against the War and others. I think that's so important to break down that potential danger. Thank you, Doug. Let's go to Bryan, and we'll close with Medea.
Okay. A lot of what Doug said is absolutely spot on as such. Take you back to 1968 in Paris. Danny the Red, when asked, what are you supposed to do, is be reasonable, demand the impossible. And what we need to do, what our role here is to demand the impossible. We're the ones that are going to be pushing these folks. Today, Nancy Pelosi, $15 minimum wage. She's all in on the 15. You think that would have happened a few years back? No. Okay. It's remarkable. This is the moment. So what we need to do is we need to keep the pressure on. The aid package, you're talking 2,000 or 1,400. Keep the pressure on. And this means, once again, if any Democratic politicians start getting cold feet or chills, it's our time to put those feet to the fire. But other than that, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Bryan. Back to the classic advice there. Medea, bring us home.
Well, it's so ironic because we in the more progressive movement, we believe that COVID is real. And so we don't want to get out on the streets. And yet this is exactly the time to get out on the streets and not just leave it to the right to take over our capitals, but to get out there and demand healthcare during a time of a pandemic. And so the next best thing was what Doug got into the mix about demand the vote. And I was on the side of yes, demand the vote. And I think we should be demanding a vote on Medicare for all over and over and over, and just really go after those who don't, who vote against it. And go after Nancy Pelosi to demand that she put that to a vote. And then in terms of just the larger issue, I agree. I think the movement is in a good place right now, and that we have strong anti-racist movements, strong environmental movements, strong movements around $15 an hour and that kind of thing. And I want to just close maybe with a good example of a movement that brings these issues together, which is the Poor People's Campaign, because they do bring in the triple evils of poverty, racism, militarism, and they've added the climate into that. And they've developed the positive, which is a people's agenda, and working very closely with the Progressive Caucus in Congress on a people's agenda. And it was just brought tears to my eyes to hear Reverend Barber giving the homily to Joseph Biden the day after inauguration and talking about we have to get off the war economy. So there are some good movements out there, DSA. I mean, we know a lot of these, and we just have to make them stronger and not divide people by, do you still believe that there is hope for the Democratic Party or not? I think it's really about the issues themselves, and we have to have big tents on those issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Medea, and lots of enthusiasm for your comments in the chat box. Well deserved. There's the utopian possibility of the chat box. The unspoken possibilities and desires of people. And I think
Jacques Lacan would probably have a word for that, I guess.
Yeah. The what is not spoken but is somehow still said. Yeah, I want to thank our three guests again and for being here, for Doug Henwood, Medea Benjamin, and Bryan Snyder. Thank you very much for being the center of, I think, a really rich, fast-moving, but also deep-diving conversation here on Shelter in Solidarity. We will be back in 2 weeks for our next show, which will focus on the challenges and the necessity of progressive and left media in this COVID capitalism crisis moment. We will have editors from Monthly Review, as well as a number of other progressive left local and national publications. And we hope you will join us for that. I mean, as it is to get in a way, metaphorically speaking, getting the chat box comments into the public consciousness and making it the new normal for discussion. It has everything to do with the media outlets that are available and the kinds of communication, ideas, and information that can be disseminated across the society. So please come back in 2 weeks, Thursday night as usual, 7 p.m. Eastern, for our third show of 2021, our 33rd show of Shelter in Solidarity. I want to thank our co-sponsoring organizations, newest of which is the Liberty Tree Foundation, which came on board recently, and we're really so glad to have you all involved. We also are sponsored by the journal Socialism and Democracy, by the Community Organizing Center Encuentro Cinco, by the independent publisher of Working Class Stories, Hardball Press, and we have producers I need to thank: Linda Liu, Seren Mudliar, Kira Mudliar, Tim Sheard, Mark Soderstrom, and our newest production team member, Rachel Patton. Welcome aboard, Rachel. It's glad to have you. Thank you to everyone for your contributions. And if you do want to hang out with the producers for a few moments after we stop recording and Zoom casting live, you're welcome to do so. We usually hang around and debrief. This is an all volunteer project, and your support is much valued in whatever form you can offer it. Thank you all, and we'll hopefully see you in a couple of weeks. Until then, stay safe, stay engaged, and stay together.